U.S. President Joe Biden and the Republican Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, say talks to stop the country from defaulting on its debt have been productive. Mr. McCarthy says Democrats need to agree to curb spending if they want Republican support for a deal. Treasury officials say without an increase on borrowing limits, known as the debt ceiling, the U.S. could default by June the 1st. The current cap is about $31.4 trillion.
Okay, well, I'm glad the speaker's here today. We're optimistic we may be able to make some progress because we both agreed default's not really on the table. We've got to get something done here. And the consequence for failing to pay our bills would be that American people would have a real kick in their economic well-being. Matter of fact, the rest of the world would too. And so we also agree we need to reduce the deficit. And I might add, in my first 2 years as president, I reduced it by $1.7 trillion. It matters. And so I'm all for continuing to reduce the deficit. And but we both talked about the need for a bipartisan agreement. We have to be in a position where we can sell it to our constituencies. We're pretty well divided in the House, almost down the middle, and it's not any different in the Senate. So we got to get something that can sell to both sides.
I felt we had a productive discussion. We don't have an agreement yet, but I did feel the discussion was productive in areas that we have differences of opinion. We're going to have the staffs continue to get back together and work on some of the things that we had talked about.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, what are the biggest sticking points in the negotiation? And the president, he said that he's willing to cut spending, but he also wants to raise revenue as well. Are you willing to talk about that?
No. So the problem is not revenue, the problem is spending. So if you want to know where our differences have been, it's always been the same place. I simply believe, like any household, like any business, like any state government, when you're this far out of whack, you have to spend less than you spent last year.
How would you describe the tone of the conversation tonight between you and the president?
I think the tone tonight was better than any other time we've had discussions.
Kevin McCarthy. Well, Arise U.S. correspondent Eric Ham has been monitoring developments, and he joins me live now from Washington. Good to see you, Eric. So 9 days to the deadline that could see government services in the U.S. shut down. Talks about raising the debt limit that could prevent this from happening seem to be going down to the wire. What's the latest?
They are, Charles. And while we know that both President Biden and Speaker Kevin McCarthy continue to talk, unfortunately, they're not coming to an agreement on anything tangible that would actually bring a resolution to this standoff. So what we're seeing here is the talks are continuing, the optimism between both parties, President Biden and Kevin McCarthy is certainly there, but there are 9 days until the United States runs out of money and is unable to pay its bill. And what we see right now is they are no closer to a solution than they were when they first met weeks ago.
So, I suppose the obvious question is, what are the big sticking points? I understand the White House is now offering to keep spending flat for this year and the next, while Republicans want to increase defense spending whilst cutting everything else.
Well, Charles, there are a number of sticking points that neither side can actually get around right now. The biggest issue is Republicans want work requirements for those who receive the social safety net. So those who are receiving Social Security, Medicaid, they believe that there should be a work requirement for that. In addition to that, while you just mentioned that Republicans want to keep government spending flat, the president wants to actually address the issue of tax revenue, meaning he wants to peel back some of those Trump tax cuts on the wealthiest Americans so that there's actual more revenue coming in as well as the cuts that are being made. And what we're seeing is both sides are just dug in. President Biden refuses to agree to a work requirement on the social safety net, and Kevin McCarthy refuses to actually address the issue of revenue regarding eliminating tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. And right now, neither side is willing to budge on these parameters, which means there is no deal to be had at this time.
And of course, whatever agreement they reach has to be done in time, because I understand it's got to pass the House and the Senate. But what would be the impact, Eric, of defaulting? I mean, who would feel it the most? Would it be ordinary Americans, the overall economy, the international community, disruption to the world's financial markets, or all of the above?
All of the above, Charles. I mean, look, the United States has the largest economy in the world. If the United States sneezes, the rest of the world is certainly going to catch a cold. If, in fact, the United States default, 1 million American jobs are lost immediately. In addition to that, let's take the U.S. military, which projects its power all across the world. So we're talking about military who will not get paid because there is no money to literally pay them. In addition to that, many of the U.S. agreements to provide weapon systems to other countries cannot happen because those contractors aren't getting paid from the U.S. government as a result of those contracts. In addition to that, we know that U.S. trading is integral to the global economy. So any goods that are imported to the United States will not, or will be very difficult to be purchased, because many Americans who receive Social Security benefits, food stamps, anything like that, they will not, government workers will not be getting paid. And of course, to say nothing of what would happen to the bond markets, U.S. Treasury T-bills, it would be a catastrophic calamity of epic proportions if, in fact, this went through.
Well, I mean, it sounds like a right royal mess there. Well, let's move away from that and turn to the race for the White House, Eric. The only black Republican, Senator Tim Scott, has launched his bid for the presidency. Tell us about that and how you assess his chances.
Well, that's right. He has now officially entered the race. We know that he had an exploratory committee where he was looking at getting into the race. He made it official yesterday. And while many see him as a candidate who is going to have very difficult gaining traction, he does enter the race with an enormous amount of resources. He has a large war chest to be able to compete. And many see him as a happy warrior. And quite frankly, Charles, there are some who believe that he is going to be the Kamala Harris of this election cycle, which means that in 2020, you knew that Kamala Harris was going to be on that presidential ticket. You just didn't know what order that she would be on the ticket. Many see Tim Scott as someone who could be a vice presidential running mate. In fact, Donald Trump sent out a message on his Truth Social yesterday congratulating Tim Scott for getting into the race. That speaks to how he sees him as not much of a threat, but also as a potential candidate who would give him the credibility with other conservatives if, in fact, he were the nominee. And of course, we know that Tim Scott is well liked by many of his Senate Republican colleagues. In fact, already we know member of Senate leadership, Tim Thune, who has already endorsed him for his presidential candidacy.
Eric, thanks very much indeed. Eric Ham is Arise U.S. correspondent. He was talking to me there from Washington.